You've probably heard of the Rothschilds, the banking dynasty that financed Europe's wars and rewrote its politics. But few remember the family who did the same in the East. They were called the Sassoons, exiles turned financiers, merchants turned monarchs of trade. They built fortunes from goods the world demanded and governments condemned. They mastered the global economy before it even had a name. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Sassoon story begins not in London or New York, but in Baghdad, in the old Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 19th century. David Sassoon was born in 1792, the son of the treasurer to the Ottoman governor. For generations, the Sassoons had been successful Jewish merchants, managing trade routes that stretched from Basra to Persia. But that prosperity came at a cost. In the volatile politics of empire, wealth always drew suspicion. When power shifted, the Sassoons fell out of favor. Persecution followed. In 1829, David fled Baghdad with nothing but his family, his faith, and his knowledge of trade. He ended up in Bombay, a humid, crowded colonial outpost under British control. It wasn't the empire's capital, but it was its artery, the link between Britain's mills and Asia's markets. For a refugee, it was both exile and opportunity. David Sassoon arrived with no formal education, no title, and no land. But what he did have was priceless experience. He understood supply chains before the word existed. He knew what the British wanted, what India could produce, and what China would buy. And above all, he knew that where there is instability, there is profit, if you have the courage to stay when others flee. He began small. Cotton, yarn, textiles, anything that could move through the ports. But he did something different. He built trust across cultures. He hired Jewish, Indian, and Arab merchants, spoke multiple languages, and understood that relationships, not contracts, built empires. In a city divided by caste, creed, and colonial hierarchy, Sassoon created something radical, a network that ignored borders. And then came the product that would make him rich and infamous: opium. The British East India Company had long monopolized the trade, exporting opium grown in India to China, where addiction was widespread and growing. The Chinese government had banned the drug, but demand never disappeared. Smuggling became the shadow economy of the 19th century, and Sassoon stepped into it with precision, not chaos. He didn't run opium dens or smuggling boats himself. He financed, insured, and supplied the trade. The banker behind the merchant behind the empire. His company, David Sassoon & Cover, became a financial and logistical backbone of Britain's China trade. By the 1840s, his ships were sailing under the Union Jack, his warehouses filled with goods bound for the East. To his critics, he was profiting from misery. To his defenders, he was doing what every empire did, turning vice into order, chaos into cash flow. But whatever your moral lens, the result was undeniable. David Sassoon became one of the richest men in Asia. By the 1850s, he was financing factories, building ports, and establishing mills in Bombay that employed thousands. He built synagogues, hospitals, and schools, some of which still stand today. He reinvested his fortune, not just in trade, but in infrastructure. He didn't just move goods, he built the roads they moved on. This was the quiet genius of the Sassoon model. Profit wasn't the end goal, it was the means to build permanence. Every dollar earned in opium or cotton was turned into something tangible: property, ports, or industry. And it worked. When the American Civil War disrupted cotton supplies to Britain in the 1860s, Indian cotton became vital, and the Sassoons controlled it. When Chinese silver payments flooded the markets, they handled the exchange. Every global disruption became their local opportunity. But success brought competition, and empires don't share easily. The British East India Company eyed the Sassoons with suspicion. The Chinese authorities despised them. Rival merchant families tried to undercut them. Yet David Sassoon's network held strong, partly because it was built on family. He sent his sons across the empire, to Baghdad, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and London, each one establishing a new branch of the family business. They weren't just traders, they were ambassadors of capital. Wherever the British flag went, the Sassoons followed, financing its journey. By the time David Sassoon died in 1864, his fortune stretched across continents. His sons had become global financiers, his name synonymous with reliability in London and Hong Kong alike. Elias David Sassoon, his eldest son, expanded into China, opening offices in Shanghai and Hong Kong, just as the ports were forced open by the Opium Wars. There, the Sassoon Empire entered its second phase, from trade to finance, from merchant wealth to banking power. Shanghai in the late 19th century was a strange city, half Chinese, half colonial, built on opium silver and foreign debt. Banks and brothels shared the same streets. Every Western power wanted a piece, and the Sassoons provided the credit to make it happen. They built warehouses, financed shipping, and bought land in what would become the Bund, Shanghai's famous waterfront of wealth and ambition. By the 1880s, they were called the Rothschilds of the East, not because they matched the Rothschilds' influence in Europe, but because they replicated their strategy, turned mobility into dominance. By the time Britain had won the Second Opium War in 1860, Chinese ports were flooded with the drug. Sassoon ships carried it by the ton. It was legal under British law, but devastating under Chinese reality. Addiction spread through every level of society. And yet, the global economy of the 19th century ran on this contradiction. Moral outrage on one side, profit on the other. The Sassoons didn't invent the system, they perfected it. They were the invisible hand of empire, efficient, loyal, indispensable. Their money built railways, mills, and hospitals, even as it came from one of history's darkest trades. That's the paradox of the Sassoon dynasty. They rose through brilliance, strategy, and courage, and through a system designed to reward moral blindness. But empires always evolve, and so did theirs. Because what they created wasn't just wealth, it was a template, a way of doing business without borders, of aligning profit with empire, and of turning exile into empire. The Sassoons proved that in a global system, money doesn't need a nation, only a network. And that idea didn't die with them. It became the foundation of the modern world. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Sassoons had gone from fugitives to aristocrats. The family that once traded opium and cotton now sat in London drawing rooms beside the very empire they had served. Their name appeared in the society pages of the Times. Their donations funded museums and universities, and their palaces in Bombay, Shanghai, and London glimmered with imported marble and European art. It was the perfect arc of imperial capitalism, from merchant to magnate, from exile to establishment. Albert Abdullah Sassoon, the family patriarch in Britain, had been knighted by Queen Victoria for his contributions to trade and philanthropy. His descendants intermarried with other powerful dynasties, the Rothschilds among them, binding together the financial elites of Europe and Asia in a single web of wealth. In Shanghai, the younger generation was building a different empire. The Sassoon family controlled banks, real estate, and shipping. Their flagship company, E.D. Sassoon & Coder, became one of the most powerful firms in Asia, dealing in everything from textiles to insurance. They helped transform Shanghai from a port of traders into a global financial capital. The Sassoon House, built in 1929 on the Bund, would later become the Peace Hotel, still one of the city's most famous landmarks. For decades, the Sassoons symbolized stability. When revolutions toppled monarchies, when markets crashed, the Sassoons adapted. They understood something timeless: control the flow of goods and credit, and you control the flow of history. But the 20th century was changing faster than any dynasty could predict. The empires that had protected them began to crumble. The British Empire was weakening, its colonial grip loosening. Nationalism was rising across Asia. The old trade routes that once made the Sassoons rich were turning into fault lines. Then came 1929, the crash that shook the world. The Great Depression decimated global trade. Factories closed, shipping halted, currencies collapsed. The Sassoon businesses, spread across continents, that were hit hard. But unlike most, they didn't fall. They pivoted. In India, they invested in manufacturing and construction. In China, they turned to property and finance. And in Britain, they tightened their ties with the establishment, becoming more financiers than merchants. Still, something deeper was shifting. The age of merchant dynasties was ending, replaced by the age of corporations. What had once required family networks and trust could now be managed through boards, banks, and bureaucracies. The Sassoon Empire, built on loyalty and lineage, began to lose its advantage. By the 1930s, the opium trade that had once powered their fortune was gone. Their textile empire faced competition from industrial giants. And in China, political upheaval and Japanese invasion tore apart the world they had built. In 1938, as the Second World War approached, the Sassoon companies were still profitable, but the family itself was scattered. Shanghai was no longer safe, India was moving toward independence, and London was at war. The dynasty that had once connected 3 continents now found itself fragmented by the same globalization it had helped create. After the war, the Sassoons' influence faded quietly. Their assets in Asia were nationalized or lost to revolution. Their London firms were absorbed by larger financial institutions. A few family members continued in banking and philanthropy, but the name no longer carried the weight it once did. By the late 20th century, the Sassoons, the so-called Rothschilds of the East, had become a historical footnote. Their story was buried under the headlines of nations and corporations that inherited the system they helped design. But their legacy never disappeared. It just changed form. The Sassoons were among the first to prove that money could move faster than politics, that a family or a company could transcend borders, languages, and laws. They mastered what would later be called globalization, long before the word existed. Their rise revealed an uncomfortable truth. Empire is never just about conquest. It's about credit, It's about who finances the warships, the railways, and the revolutions, and who collects the interest afterward. In that sense, the Sassoons didn't just serve the British Empire. They were the empire, its invisible engine, its financial bloodstream. And in their story lies a mirror for the world we live in today. Because modern corporations, Amazon, Apple, BlackRock, Tencent, are built on the same principles the Sassoons perfected 2 centuries ago. They don't conquer territory, they conquer markets. They don't enforce loyalty through armies, they do it through dependency. Their empires are digital, not colonial, but the structure is the same. Like the Sassoons, they operate across nations, immune to borders and accountability. They use scale as power, efficiency as weaponry, and access as control. They profit from imbalance, from the gap between what the world needs and what it can afford. And just like the Sassoons, they justify it as progress. But history is patient, and cycles have long memories. The same forces that once made the Sassoons indispensable, global trade, political instability, technological change, are now testing modern giants in the same way. What happens when the system that made you powerful becomes too fragile to sustain itself? The Sassoons rose because they understood risk. They fell because they mistook stability for safety. Their empire teaches us that no network, no fortune, no dynasty lasts forever. Only the structures they leave behind. You can still see those structures today, in Shanghai's Bund, in Mumbai's textile mills, and London's financial institutions. Their fingerprints are everywhere, invisible, but indelible. The Sassoons proved that exile can become empire, that faith can become finance, and that wealth can outlive nations. But they also left a warning, one the modern world keeps ignoring, that when money becomes the only passport and profit becomes the only principle, history doesn't remember your brilliance. It remembers your consequences. Because every empire built on imbalance eventually pays its debt. And the ledger of history always comes due. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.